Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for inviting me, and it's always a pleasure to speak at SMS for, for several times already. Um, and thank you, Laszlo, for giving such a great talk. And in a way, I'm going to be arguing precisely against the interpretation of the whole developments as miscalculation. And because the problem is that when we are focused on the miscalculations of supposedly of the decision makers, the burden of the explanation goes to some irrationality, the mistakes, the irrational ideology, fanaticism, something else. And we are forgetting about the rational interests which are actually driving the decision makers into those developments. And that the interests which are not even supposed to represent the national interest of either Ukraine, Russia, or well, the European Union, and even not necessarily obviously the universal interest of the humanity, which is supposedly is not about to have more war, more violence. The decision makers are pursuing the interest which, well, they give them profit, power, various, you might say, short-term benefits at the expense of the long term and at the expense of the broader interest. But nevertheless, they are pretty rational, and in terms of like winning something, they not necessarily miscalculate. They actually calculate very well. Miscalculation is when we play chess and make a blunder, right? But the reality may be is that actually that we even do not understand what kind of game we are playing. And that's a much bigger problem. So I'm going to first to speak about something that we might call the fall of the Ukraine's victory narrative, and why it actually reflects much deeper crisis of knowledge about the post-Soviet space, much deeper problem than miscalculations. I'll try to briefly outline the way I see kind of like an alternative explanation for what was driving those developments which we are now actually encountering in 2025. And if I'll have some time, I'll also speak of what it means for the future of Ukraine in the context of those developments. So the current state is actually that I think we see something as a fall down of the whole narrative about Ukraine's victory, which has been emerging since 2022. So if you can recall the spectacular defeat of the original invasion by Russia, believes that Ukraine may actually overcome Russia also on the military field because Ukraine proved to be resilient, resistance is strong. Putin underestimated it. Probably he was just too obsessed about history. He truly believed in that we are one people and didn't understand that Ukrainians are going to fight. Ukrainians unite around Zelensky and the whole political elite. The West is behind Ukraine and is going to support Ukraine however long it might take. And Russia, well, falling on the battlefield, it's going to collapse under the burden of the sanctions. It's going to be diplomatically isolated. And basically, that's what Russian defeat is the most probable scenario what is going to happen as a result of the war, and maybe even change of the political regime, and or even the disintegration of Russia, finishing the very long process of collapse of the Russian Empire, which started since 1917. Now we are 3.5 years after that narrative became quite dominant, and we looking at the military, political, economic, international, social dimensions, we see something almost like the opposite. Like on the military field, we should not be misled by the very slowly moving front line. The reality is that the Russian army is actually making a slow, gradual, but steady offensive for over a year already. And the logic of the attrition war is not so much about the territory, but about inflicting much bigger damage on the enemy than our army is being inflicted in response. And in this logic, Russia is winning, and this is also something that is understood among many, even Ukrainian analysts, who will point to that, well, obviously those data are like a military secret, but well, there are different estimations that Ukrainian army is actually contracting, but the Russian army is continuing to be increased and more ready to proceed with the way they are fighting the war, at least for a certain time, which Ukraine might not have. What is even more complicates the situation for the Ukrainian army is the evident crisis of motivation, the crisis of morale, which is reflected in the number of, actually the record high number of desertion, of AWOLs among Ukrainian soldiers, AWOLs peaking for the first half of the 2025, over 200,000 of registered cases of soldiers absent without leave, which, according to the common knowledge, are registered actually probably in the minority of cases. That means a very high number of Ukrainian soldiers actually not absent at the front line. The high record number of desertions. Economically, what we've seen is not the collapse of Russia. In 23 and 24, Russian economy was actually growing among the fastest in Europe. Also, to a certain extent, also as a result of sanctions, which in particular provided the opportunity to appropriate certain property, opportunity for impulse substitution, well, military Keynesianism, and there are actually certain conditions why, in Russian case, it might provide quickly certain economic benefits, which might not be actually necessarily the case for the EU. And at this moment, there are a lot of discussions about the looming crisis in Russia. However, the economic slowdown, which is in fact at least partially intentional in order to curb the very high inflation that Russian economy was experiencing in the last years. The slowdown does not mean necessarily economic collapse, not necessarily economic crisis. And well, quite many analysts think that, well, even with these developments, Russian economy might survive this intensity of the war for 2 or 3 years, which again, Ukraine might not have. And we should look at the Russian economy in comparison with the Ukrainian economy, which is doing much worse and worse. Well, the IMF recently estimated that Ukraine might need between 10 and 20 billion to cover the deficit just for this year. Ukrainian Minister of Defense recently said that even in order to be on a par with the Russian military budget, Ukraine needs 120 billion for the next year, and that means something like twice more than Ukraine receives from the West at this moment. And we are speaking about these economic problems at the moment when United States is evidently trying to exit the war and to limit the support for Ukraine as to the minimum, but not to probably to have something like another Afghanistan. Politically, there have been many speculations about possible elite split in Russia. The elites which were not supposedly interested in the war, some moment they might, for example, organize a coup d'etat against Putin. But there have been so many major opportunities for that, starting from the start of the full-scale invasion itself, then to the mobilization called by Putin in response to the military defeats and retreats in the end of 2022. Then the Wagner mutiny, then invasion to Kursk region, then now the escalating attacks by Ukrainian drones on the Russian cities and on certain economic facilities. All of these developments are not leading, which actually provide an opportunity to organize something against Putin, but they're not leading to any elite coordination against him. And instead, what we see in Ukraine is further political fragmentation. So that unity around Zelensky, which might have existed in 2022, is not there anymore. And the recent conflict around corruption and anti-corruption institutions is just one of those manifestations. But also the escalating attacks and counterattacks between Zelensky and the opposition, the growing criticism of consolidation of power, which is, well, the Western press sometimes compares Zelensky to Putin, which would not be possible even like a few months ago. And well, on the political level, the divisions in the Western camp, and not just between Trump and EU, but also between the EU countries. So think about Orban, think about Fico, think about possible changes of government that might bring the political forces which are much more kind of like open to Russia. And also the conflicts within the European societies, which have the burden of the continued substantial financial and also the consequences of rearmament policies, which rather than uniting the Europeans may actually exacerbate the divisions among them. And on the international level, at this moment looks like it's not like Putin is isolated. It's like EU is becoming more isolated. That Ukraine has lost the unity of the West in support of Ukraine, but did not win the support from the global South, which is also something that actually has a lot of to do not with any miscalculations, not just with mistakes, but with the rational interests driving this war. And probably the most importantly is the social dimension, especially in Ukraine, the growing gap between political elite, public elites, and the society, which is reflected in the escalating crisis of legitimacy of the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian state itself, and disconnection between the majority and the people who are making decisions and also speaking on behalf of the Ukraine. And I've been speaking about distortions and evolves, but well, formally speaking, the majority of Ukrainian males are drive dodgers because they did not update their data, which for the military recruitment offices, which they were required to update last summer in 2024. Even very minimal thing that allows for the military recruitment to actually reach you and might potentially avoid those pretty brutal cases of street mobilization, which are happening every day. Well, just not happening. And we are speaking not simply about any changes in the public opinion service, and could speak a lot about their reliability. But even now we see that the majority supports to end the war via negotiations. A very opposite picture in contrast to the moods in 2022. But we are speaking about concrete behavioral indicators. The majority of Ukrainian males are not ready to sacrifice themselves for the state. And it's not just about, well, the conditions of mobilization, it's not just about the conditions of demobilization, it's not about the support by NATO. One very telling example is when Zelensky in the beginning of this year tried to use a kind of like not just coercion, but more like of attraction to the army and try to attract the youngest cohort of Ukrainian men between 18 and 24 by pretty lucrative conditions in terms of like payment, in terms of various benefits, pretty comparable to what Russian soldiers are receiving, but even better because the Ukrainian youngsters were promised to have permission to leave the country, which they're not allowed to until very recently. After just 1 year of service in the army. And in the few first months of this campaign, they were capable to recruit only about 500 or 400 young Ukrainian men. Well, in comparison, at that moment, the estimations of how many the Russian army was capable to recruit was about 1,000 per day, in contrast to several hundred in a few months. So just one example. And so we are at the moment when we actually need to state that probably the dominant perception was not underestimation, but overestimation of Ukrainian resilience. Not overestimation of Russia, but underestimation of Russia. Not overestimation of the Western unity. And this speaks about much deeper problem than miscalculations, I should say. The real developments after the 3 years of the war, they basically defied the major paradigms, the fundamental theoretical frameworks, our understanding of the rules of the game we are playing, about the whole post-Soviet transition, and probably about the development of the war. So which were those paradigms? First, the democratization. The post-Soviet states were supposed to become something like Eastern Europe and join EU. Some states were supposed to join NATO and so on and so forth. So obviously the paradigm driven by the end of history. We are now at the moment when we see rather that it's just precisely the opposite trend, which is winning, and not just in the post-Soviet space, but globally. Another paradigm which became especially fashionable recently, post-colonialism, which looks at the war specifically as at the recent manifestation of the national liberation and national defense struggles against Russian imperialism. The problem is that when we look at the post-Soviet wars, they reflect a very different class structures than those which were driving the national liberation wars in the other countries and in other centuries. Not the class coalitions of peasants, intelligentsia, national bourgeoisie, some workers, but very different classes actually driving this war. And the war with Ukraine is not a part of any kind of like social revolutionary modernization to which the classical nationalism and national liberation struggles were closely connected to, but the result of rather demodernization of the Soviet disintegration and collapse. And that's a very important difference, and actually helps to explain why Ukraine is not capable to win against Russia in a long atrocious war, like Vietnam was capable to win against the United States, or Afghanistan was capable to win against the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, against much stronger enemies. And without that much of support from the most powerful military alliance in history, NATO. Or, well, the final paradigm which actually dominates political science about the post-Soviet countries is patronal politics, which focuses on the informal structures, informal connections of the politicians, which are playing perhaps much bigger role than the formal constitutions, the rules, and so on. But this view would expect rather simply reproduction of something like crony capitalism, bad governance, mafia states, but it actually doesn't help to explain why Russia might be becoming stronger as a result of authoritarianism, which those people would expect would lead to Russian collapse, and which at this moment at least does not look necessarily happening. The Russian state may not be just the state ruled by a very narrow clique. It may actually represent some very significant interests of important groups of the elites and also of certain other social groups. And the result is that we are actually at the moment of something like crisis of knowledge, which is manifested in the inadequacy of our conceptual tools to understand the real trend of development, which defied all our previous expectations. And when the analysts are so often wrong about the war, when the politicians and officials are so much miscalculating, that reflects that we are actually lacking probably the most fundamental theoretical frameworks to have any grasp of the change in reality. And that means that we need something very different, that we need to discuss not simply miscalculations, but the whole trend of development, trend of the changes in the post-Soviet states, which have not been about the end of history, not about the decolonial, post-colonial destruction of the Russian rule, not just reproduction of paternal cycles, but the dynamics of the crisis, which is not just happening in the post-Soviet space, but reflects much global crisis. So, well, that's what I was trying to do in my work. Well, I uploaded one of the pieces which tries to articulate this argument in a more structured way. So if you're interested, please take a look at it. This is a forthcoming piece in the collection on the counter-revolution and the rise of the global right. And in very brief terms, in the last, in the time I have, well, I try to explain it also in terms of hegemony and the crisis of hegemony, about which Mario and Francesco were speaking before that. But I look at these terms not from the world system perspective, but more like a bit more closer to Gramsci himself, who understood this concept as the developments of the political dimension of the fundamental classes under capitalism, of bourgeoisie and proletariat. And hegemony is something about the political growth of unity, of organization, and of the articulation of the class interests, which at the highest stage allows the ruling class to integrate the subaltern classes, not simply via coercion, but exactly via the incorporation of at least some interest of the subalterns into the political structures of the ruling class. And this process works not just on the national level, but also on the international level. The highest development of the bourgeois hegemony, at least in our argument, was the so-called democratic capitalism of the post-Second World War years, about like several decades. Organized fundamentally by the United States, but which played not simply the role of a state, but the role of the organization of the ruling class in the global perspective. And that allowed relatively high incorporation of the at least elements, certain groups of the subaltern classes in the form of the so-called middle class, in particular, openings for the various liberal democratic institutions, opening universal suffrage. That arrangement is fundamentally contradictory. And it worked only in specific countries for a certain period of time. Neoliberalism is actually not an alternative hegemony, but rather the crisis of the bourgeois hegemony, when there is less and less attempts to incorporate the subaltern classes via the class compromise, but rather more and more reliance on the disintegration of the classes, and also it leads to the coercion. So fundamentally, hegemony crisis is, I would see it as an opposite process, as the political disintegration of the classes, as the disorganization, disarticulation, and fragmentation of the classes in the political terms, which actually works both for the ruling class and for the subaltern classes. The bourgeois hegemony in the form of the democratic capitals was fundamentally dependent on the Soviet counter-hegemony which provided the counter-hegemonic pole, and working not only within the Soviet Union until a certain moment, let's say roughly until the 70s, but also working on the global scale as the point of attraction of the working class and the communist movements in many, many countries. And this threat of the social revolution, which was actually the threat to the existential interests of the ruling class, which it pushed it to rule in a hegemonic way, in a different way, in a way more like responsible to the longer term interests. That ended. And well, that crisis actually is experienced in the post-Soviet societies in the most acute way, precisely because this is the crisis of counter-hegemony, which organized the Soviet society in a comprehensive way, and also disintegrated in a way of not just erosion, not just of the neoliberal erosion, but in the way of, well, centrifugal collapse. So we are getting then the emerging ruling class, or what I call political capitalists, as the fraction of the capitalist class whose major competitive advantage are their selective benefits from the state, typically called corruption, theft, connections to the officials, and obviously this happens in many countries and in many other places. But it is precisely in the post-socialist countries, in the countries where the state accumulated such a great amount of capital in their hands, which then became predatory, appropriated. It's where the political capitalists play such an important role. Fundamental role to understand it. And obviously this dynamics of predatory appropriation leads only to the further chaos and further disintegration. And that's why the reason for the authoritarian regimes like Putin's or Lukashenko's, which not simply rule in the interest of the very narrow clique, but actually stabilize the system, stabilize the centrifugal processes within the ruling class of the post-Soviet societies, and in a way organize the long-term collective interests by the way of coercion and balancing. But in relation to the society, they typically rely only on the passive support. The working class lacks political representation in this conflict. The capacity for the integration of the middle class is also very limited. And the result is that the middle classes are typically relying on the certain expectations to get political, economic, cultural power as a result of increased Western integration. They are becoming fundamentally comprador. And this points to the core conflict behind, well, fundamentally post-Soviet politics and also the war. The conflict between the long-term interest of the political capitalists on the one side and the kind of like a class alliance between professional middle class and transnational capital. And Caesarism provides only a deficient solution. It produces also the, well, certain resistance from the opportunistic groups of elites. It has pretty little capacity to mobilize itself. The other responses to the crisis come from below, in particular in the form of the revolutions. And the post-Soviet countries have been actually the place in the world where which experienced perhaps the highest number of the revolutions in the recent decades. But at the same time, they are kind of like deficient revolutions. They share revolutionary form, but they also share the counter-hegemonic weakness. They offer only eventful, ephemeral, temporary unities for the people, which only reproduce and escalate the crisis and lead, in particular, to non-class polarization, to political amplification of certain privileged groups, and further destabilization. So fundamentally, this conflict and these political dynamics between the vicious circle between Caesarism and deficient revolutions is at the roots of the war. And for example, we could look specifically on the conflict with NATO and the issue of the NATO integration of Soviet countries. It was fundamentally even not about Ukraine inclusion, but about Russian exclusion. And why that exclusion was happening? Precisely because the Euro-Atlantic integration or integration into any kind of like alliance with the Western leadership would necessarily mean and could not proceed without, and was never even intended to proceed without, regime and property change in Russia. And Russia could not be integrated without fundamental political economic transformation, given its very different transition path from the Eastern Europe. That is fundamentally the core of the rational conflict, which has been driven so much of the political developments in Ukraine and in the post-Soviet countries, actually. And the war itself could be looked from this perspective as extension of the Caesarist rule across the border. We should look beyond the borders. We should not well, limit our analysis with international borders and reproduce so-called methodological nationalism. We should look at these dynamics from the broader post-Soviet and actually global perspective, a way to stabilize the crisis on the larger territory, using the opportunity of Ukraine's destabilization and the incapacity of the Ukrainian political capitalists to organize themselves in any stable regime. Let me stop here and not take more time, and well, we can return to the questions, what it means for Ukraine's and maybe global future in the questions.